The day after the memorial service for my wife, I found my daughter Lila stuffing my wife's belongings into garbage bags as if they were worthless debris. "Dad, you need to forget her and move on," she said, not even looking up from the jewelry box she was emptying. But when I discovered a hidden note in my wife's suitcase, everything I believed about my family shattered into pieces I knew I'd never be able to put back together. My name is Samuel Brandt, and at 62, I thought I understood my life. I'd been a civil engineer for 35 years, building bridges that connected communities. I believed in solid foundations, careful planning, and structures designed to withstand any storm. Nothing, however, had prepared me for the upheaval that was about to dismantle everything I thought I knew about my own family. The house still carried the heavy scent of lilies and sorrow when I walked through the front door that Tuesday afternoon. Margaret had been gone for 3 days, and the rooms felt empty without her humming in the kitchen or calling out reminders about my heart medication. I expected quiet. What I didn't expect was to find my 33-year-old daughter Lila in our bedroom, methodically packing my wife's clothes into black garbage bags. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lila looked up from the dresser, her blonde hair pulled back in the same severe bun she wore to her estate management job. "Cleaning out Mom's things. Dad, keeping all this stuff around isn't healthy. You need to move forward." "It's been 3 days, Lila." "Exactly. The longer you wait, the harder it gets." She held up one of Margaret's favorite sweaters, a soft blue cardigan I'd bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. "When was the last time you saw her wear this? She's been sick for months. These clothes don't even fit her anymore." I wanted to tell her that Margaret had worn that sweater just 2 weeks ago when we'd sat on the porch watching the sunset. Instead, I watched my daughter stuff it into the bag with the casual efficiency of someone disposing of evidence. "Where's your sister?" I asked. Shouldn't Nora have a say in this? Lila's jaw tightened. "Nora's too emotional right now. She called this morning crying about wanting to keep Mom's art supplies. Can you imagine? Boxes of dried-up paint and moldy canvases. It's not healthy, Dad. For any of us." I walked to the closet and ran my fingers along Margaret's dresses. Each one held a memory: the green one from our anniversary dinner last year, the black one she'd worn to Nora's art show, the floral print that made her laugh because she said it made her look like a garden. "These aren't just clothes, Lila. They're pieces of your mother." "Mom is gone." Lila's voice was sharp, cutting. "These are just fabric and thread. Keeping them won't bring her back." Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. I went downstairs to find Miles Jensen on my porch, his expensive suit immaculate despite the October heat. Miles was Lila's fiancé, a real estate attorney with the kind of smile that made me think of sharks in shallow water. "Sam, I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I know this is a difficult time, but there are some legal matters we need to discuss sooner rather than later." "Legal matters?" Miles set his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it with practiced precision. "Estate issues, probate procedures, property transfers. The state requires certain documentation within specific timeframes. We don't want any complications down the road." I stared at the stack of papers he was pulling out. "Margaret passed 3 days ago, Miles. I understand, and I wish we could wait longer. But the law doesn't pause for grief, unfortunately. The good news is that Lila and I can handle most of the paperwork. We just need your signature on a few things." Lila appeared at the top of the stairs, a satisfied smile on her face. "Miles is just trying to help, Dad. The sooner we get the legal stuff sorted out, the sooner you can focus on healing." That night, after they'd finally left with promises to return tomorrow with more forms, I sat in my empty bedroom and tried to make sense of what felt like a coordinated assault on Margaret's memory. I'd built my career on reading blueprints, understanding how all the pieces of a structure fit together. But this felt like someone was deliberately removing load-bearing walls from my life. I was about to turn off the light when I noticed something odd. Margaret's old suitcase, the brown leather one she'd inherited from her grandmother, was sitting in the corner of the room. I was sure I'd seen Lila carrying it toward the attic earlier, claiming it was empty and not worth keeping. But if it was empty, why was it here? I opened the suitcase and found it completely bare except for the faded floral lining. But as I ran my hands along the fabric, I felt something that made my heart stop. The lining had been carefully cut and re-sewn along one edge, creating a hidden pocket. Inside that pocket was an envelope with my name written in Margaret's careful handwriting. With trembling fingers, I tore it open and read the words that would change everything. "Honey, if you're reading this, check my suitcase. The truth is inside. Our anniversary. Use it at storage unit 1 to 17. Don't trust anyone until you know what I know. I love you, Im." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my chair by the window, reading Margaret's note over and over until the words burned themselves into my memory. Storage Unit 1.17, our anniversary. What truth was my wife talking about? And why did she feel the need to hide it from our own daughter? When morning came, I called every storage facility within 20 miles of our house. On the fourth call, I hit gold. Yes, sir, we have a Unit 117 rented under the name Margaret Sullivan, the clerk said. Sullivan was Margaret's maiden name. But I can only give access to authorized users. Do you have the access code? Our anniversary. Margaret and I had been married on October 15th, 1987. I tried several combinations, 1-15-87, 10-15, 1987, but none of them worked. Then I remembered that Margaret always wrote dates the European way, day first. Try 15-187, I said. That's it, sir. When would you like to visit the unit? Before I could answer, Lila's voice cut through the house. Dad, where are you? I hung up quickly and went downstairs to find Lila and Miles setting up what looked like a mobile office on my dining room table. Papers were spread everywhere, and Miles had his laptop open with several legal documents on the screen. We brought coffee, Lila said, holding up a cup from the expensive place downtown. And we've got good news. Miles found a way to expedite the probate process. We can have everything settled within 2 weeks instead of months. 2 weeks seems fast, I said carefully. Miles looked up from his laptop. It's actually quite standard when the estate is straightforward. Margaret left everything to you and the girls, just like you'd expect. No complications, no surprises. The faster we move, the fewer fees you'll pay in court costs. I thought about the note hidden in my pocket, and no surprises. What exactly needs to be settled? Property transfers, bank accounts, investment portfolios, Miles rattled off. Margaret was quite thorough in her planning. She even updated her will just 6 weeks ago. That stopped me cold. She updated her will? When? Lila and Miles exchanged a quick glance that they probably thought I missed. While she was sick, Dad. She wanted to make sure everything was in order. It's actually quite common for people facing serious illness. But Margaret hadn't told me about updating her will. In 35 years of marriage, we'd never made a major financial decision without discussing it first. We'd planned our retirement together, chosen our insurance policies together, even picked out our cemetery plots together. Why would she suddenly change her will without mentioning it? I'd like to see the will, I said. Of course, Miles said smoothly. I'll have my office prepare a copy for you. In the meantime, if you could just sign these preliminary documents. I looked at the papers he was sliding across the table. The print was small, and there were dozens of pages. I think I'll have my own attorney review these first. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lila's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Dad, Miles is an attorney. You don't need to pay someone else when we're trying to help you. I'm sure Miles is very good at his job, but this is a big decision, and I want to be careful. Miles's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Of course, Sam. You should be comfortable with any legal documents you sign. Just keep in mind that delays can sometimes create complications. Other parties might emerge with claims, court fees accumulate, assets can get frozen pending review, but if you'd prefer to go that route... The threat was subtle but clear. Sign now, or face expensive legal battles later. I'll think about it, I said. After they left, I called my neighbor Priya Mather. Priya had been our friend for 15 years, ever since she had moved into the house next door following her divorce. She worked as a paralegal at a family law firm and had the sharpest legal mind of anyone I knew outside of a courtroom. Sam, I'm so sorry about Margaret, she said when she arrived that afternoon. How are you holding up? I'm not sure, I admitted. Priya, can I ask you something in confidence? If someone wanted to change their will, how long would it take? Priya's dark eyes sharpened with interest. Depends on the complexity. A simple will can be drafted and executed in a day if necessary. Why? I told her about Miles's claim that Margaret had updated her will 6 weeks ago. I didn't mention the note. Something told me to keep that secret until I understood more. That's possible, Priya said slowly. But Sam, Margaret never mentioned this to you? That seems unusual, especially for someone as careful as Margaret. That's what I thought. I hesitated, then decided to trust my instincts. There's something else. Lila and Miles are pushing me to sign probate documents immediately. They say waiting will cause complications. Priya frowned. That's not necessarily true. Standard probate takes months, sometimes years. There's no legal requirement to rush unless there are specific circumstances. What kind of complications did they mention? Other parties making claims, court fees, frozen assets. Sam, those are scare tactics. Yes, probate can be expensive if it's contested, but Margaret's estate should be straightforward. You were married for decades, you have 2 daughters, and presumably everything was held jointly. There shouldn't be any surprises. That word again. Surprises. Priya, would you mind looking at some documents for me, as a friend? Of course. But Sam, if you're having doubts about anything, you should trust your instincts. Margaret was one of the most organized people I knew. If something feels off, it probably is. That evening, I drove to the storage facility. It was a sprawling complex of beige buildings on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people stash the accumulated debris of their lives. The office was closed, but a security guard let me in after I showed my ID and gave him the access code. Unit 117 was in the back corner of the complex, away from the main traffic areas. When I rolled up the metal door, I found myself staring at a space that was maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, filled with boxes, furniture, and items I'd never seen before in my life. There were photo albums I didn't recognize, financial documents and files marked with dates going back months, and a small safe I'd never seen before. But what caught my attention was a manila envelope sitting on top of everything else, with "For Sam" written in Margaret's handwriting. Inside the envelope were bank statements for an account I'd never heard of, showing deposits and withdrawals going back 2 years. The most recent statement showed a balance of over $150,000. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note from Margaret. Sam, I opened this account because I was worried about some things I discovered. The money came from selling my mother's jewelry and some investments I made separately. I didn't want to worry you while you were dealing with your heart problems last year, but I think someone has been stealing from us. Check the house account statements against these dates. The truth is in the numbers. I love you, and I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this in person. Trust Priya. Don't trust anyone else until you know what I know. M. I sat in that storage unit for 2 hours, going through Margaret's hidden files by the light of my phone's flashlight. What I found made me shiver. Margaret had been conducting her own investigation. She'd discovered discrepancies in our joint bank account. Small withdrawals that I'd never authorized, transfers to accounts I'd never heard of, and changes to our investment portfolio that neither of us had approved. Someone with access to our financial information had been systematically stealing from us for over a year, and according to Margaret's notes, she'd figured out who it was. I barely slept that night, Margaret's files spread across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle I was afraid to complete. By morning, I'd traced a pattern of theft that was both sophisticated and brazen. Small amounts taken regularly, just under the threshold that would trigger bank alerts. Investment changes made through online access, with confirmation emails redirected to an address I didn't recognize. But it was the final document in Margaret's file that made my hands shake. A printout of an email exchange between someone using the initials LB and MJ discussing the old man's accounts. And timeline for full access. LB, Lila Brandt. MJ, Miles Jensen. My own daughter and her fiancé had been stealing from us. I was still staring at the evidence when Lila knocked on the door at 8 a.m. sharp. She was carrying a box of pastries and wearing the bright smile she used when she wanted something. Morning, Dad. I brought your favorites from Miller's Bakery. Miles is running a little late, but he'll be here soon with the revised documents. I watched her set up the pastries on the counter, chattering about how beautiful the weather was and how we should get the legal paperwork finished so we could focus on celebrating Mom's life instead of dwelling on paperwork. Every word felt like a performance, and I wondered how long she'd been lying to me. Lila, I said carefully, how well do you know our family's financial situation? She paused in arranging the pastries. What do you mean? Bank accounts, investments, that sort of thing. You work in estate management. You must have some idea of what your mother and I accumulated over the years. Well, I know you and Mom were always careful with money. You probably have enough saved for a comfortable retirement. She was choosing her words too carefully, like someone walking through a minefield. Why do you ask? Just curious about what Miles meant yesterday when he mentioned investment portfolios. Your mother and I kept things pretty simple. Lila's laugh sounded forced. Oh, you know Miles. He uses technical terms for everything. He probably just meant your savings accounts and the house. Before I could respond, Miles arrived with his briefcase and that shark smile. Good morning, Sam. Beautiful day, isn't it? Perfect weather for getting business taken care of. Actually, Miles, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about Margaret updating her will 6 weeks ago. I'd like to see the original document. Miles's smile flickered for just a moment. Of course. I have a copy right here. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and handed me several pages of legal text. I read through the will carefully. It seemed standard. Everything left to me, with provisions for Lila and Nora after I was gone. But something nagged at me about the language. Margaret had always been precise in her writing, but some of the phrases in this document didn't sound like her voice. "This was witnessed and notarized?" I asked. "Absolutely. Margaret came to my office with 2 witnesses. Everything was done properly." "Which office?" Miles hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "My downtown location. Why?" "I'd like to speak with the witnesses." The silence that followed was deafening. Lila and Miles exchanged another one of those looks, and I realized I was watching a conversation happen without words. "Dad," Lila said finally, "why are you being so suspicious? Miles is trying to help us." "I'm not being suspicious. I'm being careful. There's a difference." "Is there?" Miles's voice had lost some of its smoothness. "Sam, I understand you're grieving, but paranoia isn't healthy. Lila is concerned about you. We both are." "Concerned about what?" "Your mental state," Lila said quietly. "Dad, you've been acting strange since the funeral, asking odd questions, refusing to sign simple documents. Maybe you should talk to someone. Dr. Sato mentioned that grief can sometimes cause confusion in people your age." "People my age?" As if being 62 made me senile. "When did you talk to Dr. Sato?" I asked. "Yesterday. I called to ask about grief counseling resources for you. She said it's common for older people to become paranoid or suspicious after losing a spouse. It's actually a recognized symptom." I stared at my daughter, wondering when she'd become someone I didn't recognize. "I think you should both leave now." "Dad, leave, now." After they left, I called Priya and asked her to come over. When she arrived, I showed her everything: Margaret's note, the storage unit, the financial records, the email printouts. I watched her face grow grimmer with each piece of evidence. "Sam, this is serious. If these documents are authentic, we're looking at elder financial abuse and possibly fraud. The email exchange alone could be evidence of conspiracy." "What should I do?" "First, we need to secure all of this evidence. Make copies, store the original somewhere safe. Second, we need to verify the authenticity of that will. And third," she paused, looking uncomfortable. "What?" "We need to consider the possibility that Margaret's passing wasn't as natural as it seemed." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if Lila and Miles were stealing from you and Margaret found out, they had a motive to silence her. And if they were willing to forge a will, they might be willing to do other things." I thought about Margaret's final weeks, how she'd seemed anxious and distracted, how she'd insisted on going to the doctor alone for her last few appointments, how she'd started locking her purse in the bedroom instead of leaving it on the kitchen counter like she had for 30 years. "She knew," I whispered. "She knew they were stealing, and she was trying to protect us." Priya nodded grimly. "And now, they're trying to finish what they started. Sam, that will is probably fake. If they can get you to sign probate documents based on a forged will, they can steal everything legally." "How do we prove it?" "We start by checking the details. Witnesses, notary, dates. If the will is fake, there will be inconsistencies, and we need to find out if Margaret left a real will somewhere else." That afternoon, while Priya made phone calls to verify the witnesses on the will, I drove back to the storage unit. This time, I went through every box methodically, looking for anything that might be Margaret's real will. I found it in the last place I looked, taped to the inside of the small safe, along with a key and another note from Margaret. "Sam, this is my real will, witnessed by Priya and Mrs. Chen from the flower shop. The safe contains evidence of what Lila and Miles have been doing. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive, but I was afraid of what they might do if they knew I'd discovered their theft. I love you. Protect Nora. She doesn't know anything about this. M." Inside the safe were more financial documents, photographs of forged signatures, and a small digital recorder. When I pressed play, I heard Margaret's voice, weak but determined. "This is Margaret Brandt, and today is September 15th. I'm recording this because I'm afraid something might happen to me before I can tell Sam what I've discovered. Our daughter Lila and her fiancé Miles Jensen have been stealing from us for over a year. They've taken more than $200,000 from our accounts, and they've been pressuring me to sign documents that would give them access to everything. When I refused, Miles threatened me. He said that elderly people sometimes have accidents, and that it would be tragic if something happened to me before I could get my affairs in order. I'm scared, but I'm more angry than scared. They're not going to destroy what Sam and I built together. If something happens to me, I want them prosecuted to the full extent of the law." I sat in that storage unit and cried for the first time since Margaret's funeral. Not just for my wife, but for the daughter I thought I knew, who had turned into someone capable of threatening her own mother. When I finally composed myself, I called Priya. "We have them," I said simply. "What did you find?" "Everything. Margaret's real will, recorded evidence of threats, proof of theft. Priya, I think they were responsible for what happened to her." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Sam," Priya said finally, "we need to call the police." "Not yet. I want to confront them first. I want to see their faces when they realize their plan failed. That's dangerous. If they were responsible for Margaret, they're not going to harm me in broad daylight with witnesses around, but I want them to know that I know. Before the police step in, before the lawyers take over, I want to look my daughter in the eye and ask her why she did this to her own mother." The next morning, I called Lila and told her I was ready to sign the documents. I could hear the relief in her voice when she said they'd be right over. What she didn't know was that Priya was already at my house, hidden in the kitchen with a digital recorder, ready to capture whatever Lila and Miles said when they thought they'd won. They arrived within 30 minutes, both of them practically glowing with satisfaction. Miles's briefcase was thicker than usual, stuffed with what I assumed were the final documents that would transfer everything to them. "Dad, I'm so glad you've decided to move forward," Lila said, giving me a hug that felt like a performance. "Mom would want us to take care of these practical matters so we can focus on healing." "Yes," I said quietly. "Your mother definitely wanted certain things taken care of." Miles spread the documents across the dining room table with practiced efficiency. "These are pretty standard, Sam. Property transfers, bank authorizations, investment account changes. Just sign where I've marked with the yellow tabs." I picked up the first document and pretended to read it carefully. "This gives Lila power of attorney over all my finances." "Temporarily," Miles said smoothly. "Just until the estate is settled. It's much more efficient than having you deal with all the paperwork while you're grieving." "And this one transfers the house into Lila's name immediately?" "For tax purposes. Don't worry, you'll continue living here as long as you want. This just protects the property from estate taxes." I nodded as if this made perfect sense. "And what happens to Nora's inheritance?" Lila's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nora will be taken care of, Dad, but she's not in a position to handle financial responsibilities right now. You know how she is, all emotional and artistic. She'd probably just waste the money on art supplies or some ridiculous dream of opening a gallery." "So you'll manage her inheritance for her?" "Exactly. Miles and I will make sure she gets what she needs when she needs it." I set down the pen and looked at my daughter, really looked at her. When had she become so cold? When had she started talking about her sister like she was a child who couldn't be trusted with her own money? "Before I sign these," I said, "I have a question about your mother's will." Miles's hand stilled on his briefcase. "What kind of question?" "I'd like to speak with the witnesses. You said she came to your office with two people who witnessed her signature. I'd like to thank them for helping your mother during a difficult time." "Sam, that's really not necessary." "It is to me. Your mother was very particular about who she trusted. I'd like to know who was with her when she made these important decisions." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Miles and Lila were looking at each other again, having one of their wordless conversations. "The witnesses were my office staff," Miles said finally. "Client confidentiality prevents me from—" "Confidentiality doesn't apply to witnesses on a will," I interrupted. "That's public record once the will is filed for probate." Miles's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "Sam, I'm trying to help your family through a difficult time. These constant questions and delays are making a simple process unnecessarily complicated." "Are they? Or are they making a complicated fraud unnecessarily difficult?" The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Lila went pale, and Miles's hand moved instinctively toward his briefcase as if he wanted to grab it and run. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Lila's voice was barely above a whisper. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, returning with the folder of documents Priya and I had prepared. "I'm talking about the $200,000 you and Miles stole from your mother and me over the past year. I'm talking about the forged will you're trying to use to steal the rest. And I'm talking about what you did to your mother when she discovered your theft." Miles shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Sam, you're clearly not thinking rationally. Grief can cause paranoid delusions in elderly people. Maybe we should call Dr. Sato?" "Dr. Sato didn't write that fake will, Miles, and she didn't authorize those transfers from my investment accounts. But I know who did." I opened the folder and spread Margaret's evidence across the table, watching their faces as they recognized each document. Bank statements, email printouts, photographs of forged signatures, and finally, Margaret's real will. "Your mother was smarter than both of you," I said quietly. She figured out what you were doing, and she documented everything, including your threats against her life." Lila was staring at the documents like they were venomous snakes. "Dad, I don't know what Mom told you, but she didn't tell me anything. She couldn't, because you stopped her before she had the chance. But she left me everything I need to prove what you did." "You can't prove anything," Miles snapped, his professional mask finally breaking. "A few questionable bank transfers and some anxious notes from an ill older woman? That's not proof. It's the imagination of someone whose medication affected her thinking." "Is it? Then you won't mind when the police review your computers and phone records. I'm sure they'll find nothing linking you to those unauthorized transfers. And I'm sure the medical examiner won't find anything unusual when they take another look at what happened to Margaret." Miles's face had gone gray. "Sam, you're making a serious mistake. If you try to challenge Margaret's will or make false accusations against Lila and me, we'll have no choice but to have you declared mentally incompetent. Do you understand what that means? It means you'll lose control of everything. Your money, your house, your medical decisions. You'll spend whatever time you have left in a nursing home while strangers manage your affairs." "Is that a threat, Miles?" "It's a reality check. You're 62 years old, recently widowed, clearly suffering from paranoid delusions. How do you think that will look to a judge?" I smiled for the first time in days. "I think it will look like a desperate man trying to save his family's legacy from thieves. But you're right about one thing. I am making accusations. Serious ones." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?" "I'd like to report theft, fraud, and a very serious crime," I said, never taking my eyes off Lila and Miles. "And the people responsible are sitting in my living room right now." Miles lunged for his briefcase, but I was ready for him. 35 years of construction work had kept me stronger than I looked, and Miles was soft from too many years behind a desk. I grabbed his wrist and held it until he stopped struggling. "Going somewhere?" I asked. Lila was crying now, but they weren't tears of grief or remorse. They were tears of rage and frustration. "Dad, you don't understand. We were trying to help you. The money we took was for your own good. You and Mom were too trusting, too naive. People would have taken advantage of you." "People like you?" "We're family. We were protecting your assets, making sure they'd be managed properly when you got too old to handle them yourself." "By stealing them?" "By securing them. Dad, you're already showing signs of cognitive decline, the paranoid thoughts, the confusion, the inability to make simple decisions. We were planning for your future care." I stared at my daughter and realized she truly believed what she was saying. In her mind, taking money was protection, deception was planning, and ending a life was kindness. "And what about your mother?" I asked softly. "Was that part of protecting me too?" Lila's tears stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. Mom was suffering. She was in pain, confused, terrified. What happened to her was a release. What happened to her was a crime. "Prove it," Miles said. He'd regained his composure, slipping back into the role of the calculating attorney. "Show that Margaret didn't pass from natural causes. She was ill, Sam. She had heart problems, diabetes, circulation issues. She was on a long list of medications. Even if you could show we were handling your finances, which you can't, that doesn't make us criminals responsible for her passing." He was right, and we both knew it. Margaret's passing had been attributed to heart failure, a common outcome given her medical history. Without a post-event examination, it would be almost impossible to show otherwise. But I still had one last move. "You're right, Miles. I can't prove you caused it, but Margaret can." I pulled out the digital recorder and pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the room, weak but clear. "This is Margaret Brandt, and today is September 15th. I'm recording this because I'm afraid something might happen to me before I can tell Sam what I've discovered." As Margaret's voice described their theft, their threats, and her fears for her own safety, I watched my daughter's face transform. The mask of concern and grief fell away, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before. When the recording finished, Miles was the first to speak. "That proves nothing. Margaret was sick, medicated, paranoid. This recording just confirms that she was suffering from delusions brought on by her illness." "Maybe," I said. "But it's going to be very interesting to see what the police find when they search your computers, your phones, your financial records, and it's going to be even more interesting when they exhume Margaret's body for a proper autopsy." The color drained from both their faces. "You can't do that," Lila whispered. "I can, and I will. Because unlike you, I actually loved your mother, and I'm going to make sure she gets justice." The police arrived 10 minutes later, followed shortly by Priya and the attorney she'd called. As the officers took statements and examined the evidence, I watched my daughter and her fiancé transform from grieving family members into what they really were, criminals who'd been caught. But this was just the beginning. The real confrontation was yet to come. The arrest made the local news. Local attorney and estate manager charged with elder financial abuse ran in the Herald for 3 days straight. Miles Jensen's law firm suspended him immediately, and Lila was fired from her job pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. They were both released on bail within 24 hours, but the damage to their reputations was immediate and devastating. Miles's other clients began requesting audits of their accounts, and several filed complaints with the State Bar Association. Lila's former employer announced they were conducting an internal investigation of all the estates she'd managed in the past 2 years. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt hollow. Nora came home the day after the arrests, driving straight through the night from her apartment in Chicago. I found her sitting in Margaret's garden at sunrise, still wearing the clothes she'd traveled in, tears streaming down her face. "I should have known," she said when I sat down beside her. "I should have seen what Lila was doing." "How could you have known?" "I didn't know, and I lived with your mother every day." But I knew Lila was different. Ever since she started dating Miles, she became harder, more focused on money and status, and the way she talked about you and Mom, like you were burdens she had to manage instead of parents she loved. I put my arm around my younger daughter, marveling at how much she looked like Margaret. Same dark hair, same thoughtful eyes, same gentle spirit that Lila had somehow been born without. "There's something else," Nora said quietly. "Something I never told anyone. Last Christmas, when Lila thought I was upstairs, I heard her and Miles talking about how long you and Mom were likely to live. They were discussing actuarial tables and inheritance timelines like they were planning a business investment. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I thought I was being paranoid. Because I wanted to believe my sister wasn't capable of thinking about our parents that way. Because I was a coward." We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun rise over Margaret's roses. She'd planted them the year we bought the house, and they'd bloomed faithfully every spring for 34 years. This year, they seemed more beautiful than ever, as if Margaret's spirit was still tending them. "What happens now?" Nora asked. "Now we wait for the legal system to do its job. The district attorney says they have a strong case for financial fraud and elder abuse. Whether they can prove anything more serious?" I shrugged. "We'll see." "Do you really think they were responsible for what happened to Mom?" I'd been asking myself the same thing for days. "I think your mother uncovered their theft and threatened to expose them. I think they had motive and opportunity, but proving it is going to be difficult." "The re-examination?" "Scheduled for next week. The medical examiner agreed that what happened to Margaret should be reviewed again in light of the new evidence." Nora shuddered. "I hate that Mom can't rest in peace." "Your mother won't rest in peace until she gets justice, and neither will I." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month, but Miles's attorney was already making noise about plea negotiations. Word on the street was that Miles was willing to testify against Lila in exchange for a reduced sentence, claiming she'd been the mastermind behind the theft, and he'd been manipulated into helping her. Priya, who'd been monitoring the legal proceedings closely, warned me that this was a common strategy. "He's trying to paint himself as another victim," she explained over coffee at the diner where we'd started meeting regularly. "The innocent professional who was seduced into criminal behavior by his manipulative fiancée. Will it work? Depends on what evidence they have against each of them individually. If Miles handled most of the financial transactions, it'll be hard for him to claim ignorance. But if Lila was the one with access to your accounts..." She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. Lila had been handling Margaret's and my financial affairs for the past year, ostensibly to help us as we got older. We trusted her with passwords, account numbers, and legal documents. If she'd used that access to steal from us, it would be difficult to prove Miles's involvement unless they had direct evidence of his participation. "There's something else," Priya said carefully. "I've been doing some research on Miles's background. This isn't his first time being investigated for questionable estate management." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were newspaper clippings from 3 other cities where Miles had worked over the past decade. In each case, elderly clients had passed away shortly after updating their wills to favor Miles's firm or his associates. In each case, the inquiries had been closed due to insufficient evidence. "He's done this before," I said. "It appears so. The pattern is always the same. Identify older clients with significant assets, earn their trust, influence them to revise their wills, then benefit once they're no longer around. He's careful enough to avoid being the direct beneficiary, but he always finds a way to gain." I stared at the clippings, feeling sick. How many people has he harmed? I don't know. But Sam, this information could be crucial to the prosecution's case. It establishes a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond simple financial fraud. Have you given this to the district attorney? I'm meeting with them tomorrow, but I wanted you to see it first. This is going to turn a local financial fraud case into a multi-state investigation. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? I thought about Margaret, about the fear in her voice on that recording, about the way she'd passed while I was at a doctor's appointment that Miles had insisted I keep. I'm prepared for whatever it takes to get justice for my wife. The exhumation results came back 2 weeks later. The medical examiner found traces of a paralytic agent called succinylcholine in Margaret's tissue samples, a substance that's virtually undetectable unless specifically tested for. In the right dose, it causes respiratory failure that mimics natural heart failure. The substance is used in hospitals during surgery, but it's also accessible to anyone with connections to the medical community. Miles's ex-wife, a nurse anesthetist who divorced him 3 years earlier citing irreconcilable differences, revealed that Miles had been asking questions about untraceable agents and methods of causing fatal heart failure in elderly patients. She'd thought he was researching for a legal case. Now she realized he'd been planning fatal interventions. The case exploded into national news. The inheritance scammer, the cable news shows, branded Miles Jensen. Lila was portrayed as either his accomplice or his victim, depending on which network you watched. Our quiet suburban street became a circus of reporters, camera crews, and curiosity seekers, hoping to catch a glimpse of the house where a daughter had helped harm her own mother. Through it all, Nora and I tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. We had dinner together every evening, worked in Margaret's garden, and slowly began the process of actually grieving for the woman we'd lost, instead of fighting for justice. But I knew the real test was still coming. The trial was scheduled to begin in 2 months, and I would have to testify about finding Margaret's evidence, the confrontation with Lila and Miles, the years of trust they'd violated, and the life they'd stolen. I would have to look my daughter in the eye and tell a jury why I believed she'd harmed her own mother. The night before the trial began, I sat in my bedroom reading Margaret's real will one more time. She'd left everything to me, with instructions that after my passing, the estate should be divided equally between our daughters if they have proven themselves worthy of the trust and love we placed in them. Lila had proven herself worthy of neither, but she was still my daughter, and tomorrow I would help ensure she faced the consequences for the rest of her life. I closed the will and tried to sleep, knowing that when I woke up, the final chapter of this nightmare would begin. The courthouse was a zoo. News vans lined the street. Reporters thrust microphones at anyone who looked like they might be connected to the case, and protesters held signs reading "Justice for Margaret" and "Maximum Penalty for Elder Abuse." I'd never imagined that our family tragedy would become a national spectacle, but the case had struck a nerve with people across the country who were worried about their own aging parents being victimized by trusted family members. District Attorney Sylvie Corvin was a small woman with steel in her spine and a reputation for prosecuting white-collar crime that had earned her national recognition. She'd taken personal charge of the case, she told me, because elder abuse was an epidemic that needed to be stopped with high-profile convictions. "Your wife's evidence is extraordinary," she said as we prepared for my testimony. Most elder abuse cases rely on financial records and witness testimony. We rarely have recordings of the victims describing their fears or such detailed documentation of the theft. Margaret built us a roadmap to conviction. Miles and Lila were being tried together, despite their attorneys' attempts to secure separate trials. Miles's lawyer was an expensive criminal defense attorney from the state capital who specialized in white-collar crime. Lila's lawyer was a local public defender who looked overwhelmed by the media attention and the complexity of the case. The strategy differences were obvious from the opening statements. Miles's attorney painted him as a successful professional who'd been seduced and manipulated by a greedy woman desperate for her inheritance. Lila's attorney argued that she'd been a loving daughter trying to help her aging parents, who'd been manipulated by a sophisticated criminal with a history of elder abuse. They were turning on each other, just as Priya had predicted. I was the prosecution's first witness. As I walked to the stand, I could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom, the jury, the media, the families of Miles's other suspected victims who'd traveled here hoping to see justice for their own loved ones. But the only eyes that mattered were Lila's. My daughter sat at the defense table in a conservative blue suit, her hair pulled back in the same severe style she'd worn the day I found her packing Margaret's belongings. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the weight of the charges against her. When our eyes met, I saw a flicker of the little girl who used to climb into my lap and ask me to read her stories about princesses and happy endings. Then I remembered Margaret's voice on that recording, describing her fear that something might happen to her, and my sympathy hardened into resolve. District Attorney Corvin walked me through the timeline methodically, finding Margaret's note, discovering the storage unit, uncovering the evidence of theft, confronting Lila and Miles with the proof of their crimes. The jury listened intently as I described each piece of evidence, each revelation that had shattered my understanding of my own family. When we got to Margaret's recording, Corvin asked permission to play it for the jury. Margaret's voice filled the courtroom, weak but determined, describing her discovery of the theft and her fear for her own safety. Several jurors wiped their eyes as they listened to a seriously ill woman's desperate attempt to protect her husband from their own daughter. "Mr. Brandt," Corvin said when the recording finished, "in your opinion, was your wife suffering from any kind of mental impairment when she made this recording?" "Absolutely not. Margaret was sharp as a tack right up until the day she passed. She balanced our checkbook, managed our medications, and handled all our insurance paperwork. If anything, her illness had made her more focused on making sure our affairs were in order." "Did she ever express paranoid thoughts or irrational fears about other people?" "Never. Margaret was one of the most trusting people I knew. She believed the best about everyone until they proved her wrong. If she was afraid of Lila and Miles, it was because they'd given her good reason to be afraid." Miles's attorney cross-examined me aggressively, trying to paint me as a grieving widower who'd been manipulated by his wife's illness-induced confusion. He suggested that Margaret's evidence was the product of distraction and medication side effects, and that I was looking for someone to blame for her passing because I couldn't accept that she'd passed from natural causes. "Mr. Brandt, isn't it true that you were struggling to manage your own health problems during your wife's final months?" "I had some heart issues, yes, but they were under control." "Didn't you miss several important medical appointments because you were confused about dates and times?" "I missed one appointment because Lila told me it had been rescheduled." "Are you certain about that?" "Because your medical records show a pattern of missed appointments and medication compliance issues." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What medical records?" "The records provided to us by your daughter, showing her concerns about your cognitive decline and her efforts to help you manage your health care." Corvin objected before I could answer, but the damage was done. Miles's attorney was suggesting that I was an unreliable witness whose testimony was tainted by my own mental impairment. Worse, he was implying that Lila had been trying to help me, not harm me. But Corvin was ready for this strategy. During redirect, she introduced phone records showing that Lila had indeed called to reschedule my medical appointment on the same day that Margaret passed, while I was sitting in the doctor's waiting room instead of being home with my wife. "Mr. Brandt, why do you think your daughter rescheduled your appointment for that specific day?" "Because she wanted me away from the house when she and Miles harmed my wife." The courtroom erupted. Miles's attorney objected, Lila's attorney objected, and the judge had to gavel for order. But the words were out there, and the jury had heard them. The next 3 days of testimony built the prosecution's case methodically. Financial experts testified about the pattern of theft, showing how Lila and Miles had systematically drained our accounts over more than a year. Computer forensic specialists presented material from Miles's laptop showing research into hard-to-detect substances and ways to trigger catastrophic heart failure. Medical experts explained the mechanism of a specific paralytic compound and how it could have caused Margaret's collapse while appearing natural. Miles's ex-wife testified about his questions regarding untraceable agents. Margaret's doctor testified about the discrepancies in her medical records that had been altered after her passing. Omar, the storage facility manager, testified about seeing Lila and Miles at the facility on the day before Margaret's memorial, trying to access her unit. But the most damaging testimony came from Miles himself. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a life sentence without parole, Miles had decided to cooperate with the prosecution. His testimony was devastating. "Lila approached me about her parents' finances about 2 years ago," he said, not looking at the defense table where his former fiancée sat. "She said they were getting old and making poor financial decisions, and she was worried about their future care. She asked me to help her gain access to their accounts so she could protect their assets." "Did you believe her concerns were legitimate?" Corvin asked. "At first, yes. It's common for adult children to become concerned about their aging parents' ability to manage money. But as time went on, it became clear that Lila wasn't interested in protecting their assets. She wanted to control them." "When did you first realize that what you were doing was illegal?" "When Margaret started asking questions about the missing money. Lila panicked. She said her mother was getting suspicious and might expose us. She asked me to help her handle the situation." "What did you understand that to mean?" Miles's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She wanted me to help her end her mother's life." The courtroom fell into complete silence. Even the reporters stopped typing. "Did you agree to help her?" "I supplied the substance. I explained how it could be used so the outcome would appear natural. I helped plan the timing so Sam would be away from the house. Why did you agree to take part in something like that? Because I was in too deep to back out. We'd already taken hundreds of thousands of dollars. If Margaret exposed us, we'd both face serious prison time. Lila convinced me that her mother was suffering anyway, and that this was a mercy act. Do you believe that now? No, Margaret Brandt was harmed for money, and I helped to do it. Lila's attorney tried to discredit Miles's testimony during cross-examination, arguing that he was lying to save himself from the harshest sentence. But the physical evidence supported every detail of his confession. Phone records showed calls between them on the day of Margaret's passing. Financial records showed the transfers of stolen money. And Margaret's own recorded testimony corroborated Miles's account of their threats against her. When Lila took the stand in her own defense, I barely recognized the woman who claimed to be my daughter. She denied everything: the theft, the threats, the harm. She claimed Miles had acted alone, forging her signatures and using her access to our accounts without her knowledge. She painted herself as another victim, manipulated by a sophisticated criminal who'd exploited her love for her parents. I would never hurt my mother, she said, tears streaming down her face. I loved her. I was trying to help my parents plan for their future care. Miles took advantage of my trust and used me to steal from my own family. But Corvin's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. She walked Lila through every transaction, every forged signature, every lie she'd told. She played recordings of phone calls where Lila discussed the theft with Miles. She showed emails where Lila had researched methods of inducing heart attacks in elderly patients. Ms. Brandt, you testified that you loved your mother. Is that why you researched untraceable poisons on your computer? I never researched poisons. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit 47, a printout of Ms. Brandt's internet search history, showing multiple searches for substances that trigger cardiac failure, hard-to-detect toxins, and how to cause a fatal outcome without being discovered. Those searches weren't mine. Miles must have used my computer. The searches were made from your home computer, using your login credentials, at times when phone records show Mr. Jensen was at his office across town. How do you explain that? Lila had no answer. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdicts in a clear, strong voice. On the charge of conspiracy to carry out a premeditated act resulting in loss of life, we find the defendant, Lila Brandt, guilty. On the charge of intentionally causing another person's passing, we find the defendant, Lila Brandt, guilty. On the charge of elder financial exploitation, we find the defendant, Lila Brandt, guilty. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant, Lila Brandt, guilty. Lila collapsed as the verdicts were read. Her attorney caught her before she hit the floor, but she was sobbing so hard she couldn't stand. For a moment, I felt a flash of sympathy for the shattered woman who had once been my little girl. Then I thought of Margaret, and that sympathy vanished. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Both Lila and Miles were given permanent incarceration with no chance of release. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, delivered a blistering condemnation of their actions. You violated one of the most sacred bonds in human society, the bond between parent and child, between those who are vulnerable and those sworn to protect them. You turned love into a tool of exploitation and used it to take not only money, but everything that truly matters. The sentences imposed today reflect not only the gravity of your actions, but society's absolute refusal to accept the exploitation of the elderly by those who should care for them most. As the bailiffs led Lila away in restraints, she looked back at me one final time. Her lips moved, and I thought she might be trying to say something, perhaps regret, perhaps affection, but I couldn't hear her over the noise in the room, and I realized I didn't want to. She was no longer my daughter. The daughter I knew was gone the moment she decided her mother's existence was worth less than an inheritance. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed me with questions about how I felt, whether justice had been served, what I planned to do now. I pushed through them without answering, Nora and Priya flanking me like bodyguards. How does it feel to know your daughter will spend the rest of her life in prison? One reporter shouted. I stopped and turned to face the cameras. My daughter passed the same day my wife did, I said quietly. The woman who was convicted today is a stranger who wore my daughter's face while she committed horrific crimes. Justice has been served, but it won't bring back the 2 women I lost. That evening, Nora and I sat in Margaret's garden as the sun set behind her roses. The media circus was finally over, the reporters had moved on to other stories, and our street was quiet again. What happens now, Dad? Nora asked. I thought about Margaret's real will, which left everything to me with the provision that it should go to whichever daughter had proven herself worthy of trust and love. There was no question which daughter that was. Now we rebuild, I said. We honor your mother's memory by living the kind of life she would have wanted us to live. We take care of each other, and we make sure this never happens to another family. What do you mean? I pulled out a letter I'd been working on for weeks. I'm donating most of the estate to a foundation that helps elderly victims of financial abuse. Margaret's money is going to be used to catch people like Lila and Miles before they can destroy other families. Nora read the letter, tears streaming down her face. Mom would love this. I hope so, because everything I do for the rest of my life is going to be about making her proud. We sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out. Margaret's roses perfumed the air with their sweet scent, and for the first time since her passing, I felt something like peace. My wife was gone, and my daughter was lost to me forever. But justice had been served, and Margaret's legacy would live on in the lives she'd saved from beyond the grave. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for when I first found that note in her suitcase, but it was